Okay, so this is a second little piece, and in this little piece, I'm only going to be talking about oxygen transport, and oxygen is going to be carried using hemoglobin. So let's look at that hemoglobin structure again. Hemoglobin is a protein, and as a protein, it is all folded up into a nice 3D shape. It also has a quaternary structure, which means that it has 4 subunits. So here are the 4 subunits. Those are called globin. And in the middle of each globin is a heme group, which means that it has a iron. So Fe stands for iron. And the reason you have iron, as we've already seen, have already seen in the blood lecture, is that iron has a strong affinity for oxygen. And that's why if you just leave if you just leave iron out in the environment, it grabs onto that oxygen and makes ferrous oxide, which is rust. And that's why blood is red. Okay, so this ferrous, which is iron, it holds on to that oxygen, and that's why hemoglobin can carry oxygen. It can carry those oxygen because those oxygen can bind to and interact with the iron, which is the heme group of the hemoglobin. Okay, so the oxygen will be carried with the hemoglobin, and this allows the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood to go way up because the oxygen does not dissolve well in the plasma, which is water mostly. But if it's carried around with the protein hemoglobin, you can get a lot more oxygen into that blood. Okay, and that's why we have red blood cells, help carry that oxygen. Okay, so let's talk about the terms loading and unloading reactions. Okay, so as we've seen before, if hemoglobin is not bound to oxygen, it's called deoxyhemoglobin. And so if you take the deoxyhemoglobin not bound to oxygen and then just add the oxygen, it becomes oxyhemoglobin. This right here is called the loading reaction. So loading reaction just means you're loading up the hemoglobin with oxygen, putting oxygen onto the hemoglobin to be transported around. And therefore, the unloading reaction would just be the opposite, right? So you take the oxyhemoglobin that has that oxygen bound to the hemoglobin, and then you just take the oxygen off. You're unloading it off of it so that it can then go into the cells. So taking the oxygen off, that's called the unloading reaction. So it's just loading up the oxygen or unloading the oxygen off of the hemoglobin. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the factors that talk about unloading and loading reactions. So the biggest thing that's going to affect how much of the oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin, that is going to be the partial pressure of that oxygen. Okay, so remember that the partial pressure in the lungs and the major arteries is going to be high, and the partial pressure of the oxygen in the veins and the tissues is going to be low. Okay, so it creates a pressure gradient as you travel along the systemic circuit. Okay, and then the second thing we're going to talk about is the affinity of the hemoglobin for that oxygen. And when I say affinity, I mean how much it wants to hold on to that oxygen. Okay, so remember that we've got kind of 2 competing factors here. We have the partial pressure, which is going to drive diffusion away for it, so increase the amount of unloading. Then we have the affinity for the oxygen, which is wanting to hold on to it. So they're kind of opposing each other. So if you graph it, so in this graph right here, what we're looking at is the percentage of hemoglobin that is bound to that oxygen as a variable of the percentage of the partial pressure of that oxygen. Right, so that as you change the partial pressure, how does that affect the percentage of hemoglobin bound to that oxygen? And so what we're looking at in this graph right here, so on this x-axis, it's set up so that as you start with the arteries, right, so coming directly out of the heart, as the blood flows away from the arteries to the arterioles into those capillary beds and then back to the veins, you're going to have a lower and lower partial pressure. right? So lower and lower pressure of the blood. Okay, that means that you're having an increase in the concentration gradient between the blood and the tissues. There's a bigger difference here. Okay, so what we're looking at here is as we go further and further away, less and less of the hemoglobin will be bound to the hemoglobin. Less and less of the oxygen, less and less of the oxygen will be bound to the hemoglobin because the drive, the pressure gradient is so great that it has a stronger drive to unload the oxygen and give it to the tissues as you get further and further away from the heart. Okay, so as you get further and further away from the heart into those veins, more and more of the oxygen will be unloaded off of the hemoglobin and given to the tissues. Okay, so what we're looking at here, this is called the dissociation curve. Okay, and this dissociation curve is a picture of how strong the affinity for that hemoglobin is for that oxygen. Okay, so you can look at this right here, and you can see that here we have in a higher pressure of oxygen in the blood, you'll have a stronger affinity, and then as we get lower and lower and lower and lower, it'll have less and less of it. Okay, so this just shows you the strength of that affinity. So what we're going to look at now is how factors that will affect the strength. And so when we say affect the strength, I don't talk about any particular point. What I'm talking about is shifting the entire line around. Okay, that shows you the affinity. So an affinity is not any particular point, it's the entire picture, the entire line shows you the affinity. Okay, so let's look at this. So the first thing to understand is that hemoglobin is a protein. And like all other proteins we've seen, especially when we talked about enzymes, we already know that proteins, the shape of the proteins are affected by their environment. Okay, so that hemoglobin is going to be affected by the pH of its environment. And as it becomes more acidic, it has a lower affinity for that oxygen. And what I mean by that is the entire line is going to be shifted this direction, which means that it more readily gives off or unloads that oxygen. Okay, so in a more acidic environment, you're going to have more unloading of the oxygen away from the hemoglobin to be given off to the tissues. Whereas as it becomes more basic, because of the small changes in the shape, it's going to hold on to the oxygen more. So as you go this direction here, okay, as you go to the right, you have a lower affinity or more unloading. As you go to the left, you're going to have a stronger affinity. The hemoglobin holds on to it more, which means you'll have less unloading of oxygen to the tissues. Okay, so more acidic, more unloading, more basic, less unloading. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one we're going to look at is temperature. Okay, so for temperature here, so if we look at it, here's about normal, about 38 degrees. There's our sort of normal temperature. As you make it warmer, you're going to have more unloading. Okay, so a lower affinity, which means more oxygen will come off of the hemoglobin. And then as you make it colder and colder, it'll hold on to it tighter and you'll have less unloading. Okay, so less oxygen will be unloading at those points. Okay, so that feels like, well, what? That's a lot of confusing stuff. What the heck are we talking about? How does this relate to the body? It relates to the body because when you are exercising affects both the pH and the temperature of those tissues. Okay, so when you're exercising, especially your skeletal muscles, they're going to have a higher metabolism, so more cellular respiration occurring in them. And when you're doing more cellular respiration, that means you're going to spew off more carbon dioxide. And more carbon dioxide in the blood, we'll see later, means that you're going to create a lower pH. Okay, so exercising muscles will be more acidic than resting tissues. And then the second thing that happens when you have their higher metabolism is because all of those little contractions, you're going to be breaking apart that ATP, that creates heat, right? You're producing heat. That's why you're hot when you're exercising. And so we're going to be both more acidic and warmer in those exercising muscles. And in those exercising muscles, both the increase in temperature and the decrease in pH, both of them do the same thing to the affinity of the hemoglobin. The affinity of the hemoglobin, so the desire to hold on to the oxygen, is going to go down, which means that more oxygen will be released to those tissues. So what we have here is preferential unloading of tissues to the tissues that need it more. So the ones that are doing more metabolism are going to get more oxygen, which I think is freaking brilliant, because here we have a situation where we don't even have to do anything extra. All we have to do is allow the hemoglobin to go through the body, and then the tissues that require the higher levels of oxygen are going to get more oxygen. That's amazing. Okay, that's enough for now. I'm going to go into the carbon dioxide transport in a second.